My wife Emily and I had been married for 15 years. We met in college, where she caught my eye with her vibrant personality and brilliant smile. I was smitten from the start, and it wasn't long before we were inseparable. We got married soon after graduation, and it felt like we were living in a fairy tale. Emily and I had 2 children, a son named Jake and a daughter named Lily. Our life seemed perfect, but as the years went by, I started noticing subtle changes in Emily. At first, I brushed them off, thinking they were just the result of the daily grind and the responsibilities of raising a family. However, there were moments when I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emily started working late more often and seemed distant. She used to be so involved with our kids and me, but now she was always busy with work or lost in her thoughts. One evening as we sat down for dinner, Emily seemed preoccupied, barely touching her food. Jake, who was 10 at the time, had been talking excitedly about his new school teacher, Mr. Roberts. He was young, enthusiastic, and had quickly become Jake's favorite. Emily perked up a bit at the mention of Mr. Roberts, asking more questions than usual about Jake's school day. "Mr. Roberts sounds like a great teacher," she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. I noticed the change in her demeanor but didn't think much of it at the time. As weeks went by, Emily started volunteering at Jake's school more frequently, helping out with events and even chaperoning a few field trips. I appreciated her involvement, thinking it was good for her to be so engaged with the kids' education. But then her late nights became more frequent, and she started being secretive with her phone. Whenever I entered the room, she would quickly put it away, or if it rang, she would step outside to take the call. I tried to ignore the growing knot in my stomach, telling myself that Emily was just stressed from work. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, I decided to check our phone bill, something I hadn't done in years. I noticed numerous calls and messages to an unfamiliar number, all during odd hours. My heart sank when I cross-referenced the number and realized it belonged to Mr. Roberts. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with possibilities and fears. Was Emily having an affair with Jake's teacher? The thought was too painful to bear, but I needed to know the truth. I decided to keep a closer eye on her, hoping against hope that I was wrong. The next morning, Emily seemed her usual self, bustling around the kitchen, getting the kids ready for school. She kissed me on the cheek as she left, but I could sense a distance between us. I watched her drive away, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. I knew I had to find out what was really going on, no matter how much it might hurt. Determined to uncover the truth, I rented an old Kia Optima, leaving our family BMW 5 Series in the parking lot. The worn-out Kia would allow me to follow Emily without drawing attention. It was a hot summer day, and I had been trailing Emily for a few hours already. She said she had a meeting at Jake's school, which wasn't unusual for her, but my gut told me otherwise. That Saturday evening, I parked the Kia near the school and waited. Emily soon emerged, walking hand in hand with Mr. Roberts. My blood ran cold as I watched them, their fingers intertwined, laughing like young lovers. They walked to his car, a modest sedan, and got in. My heart pounded as I started the engine and began to follow them. They drove through town, eventually arriving at a 3-story apartment building. Mr. Roberts lived on the first floor. I parked a few blocks away and walked cautiously toward the building, keeping to the shadows. Through the window, I could see them inside, their bodies close, their laughter now muted by the walls separating us. They moved into what appeared to be the living room, and I knew what was about to happen. A rush of anger surged through me as I noticed the window in the adjacent room was wide open. Without a second thought, I climbed through it, landing silently inside. The apartment was eerily quiet except for the faint sounds of their conversation. My heart hammered in my chest as I moved closer to the living room, rage bubbling just beneath the surface. Through the doorway, I saw them, wrapped in each other's arms, their intentions clear. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't let this continue. Bursting into the room, I yelled, "What the hell is going on here?" Both of them jumped, shock and fear flashing across their faces. "Mark, what are you doing here?" Emily stammered, stepping away from Mr. Roberts. But I didn't respond. My vision was red with fury. I lunged at Mr. Roberts, landing a punch on his jaw. He staggered back, trying to defend himself, but my rage gave me the upper hand. "You think you can just take my wife?" I shouted, hitting him again. "Mark, stop!" Emily screamed, trying to pull me off him. "You're going to kill him!" But I couldn't stop. My fists flew, connecting with flesh and bone, driven by the betrayal and anger I felt. Blood smeared across Mr. Roberts's face as he tried to shield himself from my blows. The noise must have alerted the neighbors because within minutes the police arrived. They pulled me off him, their strong hands gripping my arms. I stood there, panting heavily, my fists bruised and bloodied, staring at the mess I had created. Emily was sobbing, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. "Sir, you need to calm down," one of the officers said, his voice firm but not unkind. They took my statement and Emily's, while paramedics attended to Mr. Roberts. As the reality of what I had done began to sink in, a wave of nausea hit me. I couldn't bring myself to look at Emily. Her betrayal was too fresh, too raw. The officers led me to their car, and I sat in the back seat, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. Emily stood on the sidewalk, her eyes pleading for understanding, but I turned away. By the time we reached the police station, my initial fury had cooled, replaced by a numbing sense of betrayal and disbelief. The officers led me to a small, dimly lit room where I sat in silence, waiting for what would come next. My thoughts were a tangled mess, but one thing was clear. I needed to talk to Emily to understand why she had done this. After what felt like hours, the door opened, and Emily walked in with Mr. Roberts. Seeing them together made my blood boil all over again, but I forced myself to remain calm. The teacher had a determined look on his bruised face, while Emily's expression was cold and resolute. "I'm pressing charges for the attack," Mr. Roberts declared, his voice steady. "This kind of violence cannot be tolerated." Emily nodded in agreement, her eyes avoiding mine. Yes, it was completely unprovoked. Mark has always had a temper, and tonight he just snapped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Emily, can we talk? Please," I said, my voice strained with emotion. She finally looked at me, her gaze hardening. "There's nothing to talk about, Mark. This is all your fault. You never loved me properly, and you didn't take care of me. You pushed me into someone else's arms." Her words cut deeper than any wound. I felt the rage bubbling up again, ready to explode. If it weren't for the police around, I might have lashed out once more. "You're saying this is my fault?" I asked incredulously, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're blaming me for your affair?" "Yes, I am," she replied coldly. "You were never there for me, and when you were always so distant. I needed love and attention, and you failed to provide that." I clenched my fists, my knuckles white. How could you do this to our family, to Jake and Lily? I wanted to scream, to shake her out of this twisted justification, but I knew it wouldn't help. The investigator entered the room, breaking the tension. "All right, let's get everyone's statements," he said, seating himself behind the desk. Mr. Roberts began recounting the events, exaggerating every detail to paint me as the aggressor. "He broke into my apartment and attacked me without any provocation. I was just trying to protect Emily," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Emily nodded, backing up his version of the story. "It's true, Mark just went crazy. We were only talking and he attacked Mr. Roberts out of nowhere." Each word felt like another stab to the heart. I couldn't believe that Emily was siding with him, painting me as the villain. I wanted to shout, to defend myself, but I knew it would only make things worse. The investigator took detailed notes, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for your statements. We'll process this and submit it to the court," he said, glancing at me with a hint of pity. Emily and Mr. Roberts left the room, their departure leaving a void that was quickly filled with despair. I watched them go, my heart heavy with a mix of anger and sorrow. The investigator turned to me. "You'll be staying here overnight while we sort this out," he said, not unkindly. I was led to a holding cell, the cold metal bars a stark reminder of how far my life had spiraled out of control. As I lay on the hard, uncomfortable bench, I couldn't stop thinking about Emily's words. She had blamed me for everything, twisting the knife deeper with every accusation. Morning came with the cold light of reality. I heard the cell door open and looked up to see my brother Harry standing there with a grim expression on his face. "Mark," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I've got some bad news. Mom had a heart attack early this morning. She She didn't make it." The weight of his words hit me like a freight train. I felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. "What? No, how? Why?" I stammered, struggling to process what he was saying. "She found out about you being in jail." The shock was too much for her, Harry explained, his eyes red from tears. "It happened around 5 o'clock in the morning. I came as soon as I could. I'll take care of the funeral arrangements, but you need to deal with this shameless teacher." I could barely nod, my mind reeling from the news of our mother's death. Guilt washed over me, knowing that my actions had contributed to this tragedy. Harry gave my shoulder a comforting squeeze before leaving, promising to handle everything for the funeral. As he walked out, the investigator came in. He looked at me with a mix of sympathy and professionalism. "Mark, I'm sorry about your mother," he began. "Regarding the teacher's statement, here's what will happen. Mr. Roberts has pressed charges for the assault. Given the severity of the injuries and the circumstances, this could lead to a substantial penalty for you." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "What does that mean? Jail time?" "Possibly," the investigator replied. "It depends on how the court views the case. However, you do have some mitigating factors. You were provoked by your wife's infidelity, and you have no prior criminal record. This might reduce the sentence or lead to alternative measures like probation." I nodded, still processing everything. "And what about my wife?" "The court will take her statement into account as well. Given that she corroborated Mr. Roberts' version of events, it doesn't look good for you. But we will ensure that all aspects of the situation are considered fairly," the investigator assured me. I leaned back against the cold wall, feeling utterly defeated. "What happens now?" "We'll schedule a hearing," the investigator said. "In the meantime, you'll be released on bail. But you'll need to stay away from Mr. Roberts and comply with any court orders." As the investigator left, I sat there, trying to come to terms with the avalanche of emotions and the mess my life had become. My mother's death, the betrayal of my wife, and the looming court case all weighed heavily on my shoulders. When I was finally released on bail, Harry was waiting for me outside the station. He hugged me tightly, and for the first time in a long while as we walked to his car, I couldn't help but think about the path ahead. It was going to be long and painful, but I had to face it. For my mother, for my children, and for myself. My brother took us to Mai and Emil's house. My Kia Optima was returned to the landlord at night because I ended up in the police station inside the house. The scent of breakfast filled the air. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing a meal for the kids, who were still asleep. The sight of her moving about the kitchen so calmly, as if nothing had happened, stirred a mix of emotions in me. Part of me wanted to confront her, while another part wondered if there was any point in talking to her at all. I took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen. Harry followed, staying quietly by the door. "Emily," I began, my voice strained. "I don't know if there's any point in talking about this, but why were you so quick to take Roberts' side?" She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "Because it's the truth, Mark," she said simply. "I don't love you the way I used to. I wanted our communication to come to an end." Her words were like a slap to the face. The urge to lash out surged within me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You just want to end everything, after all these years?" She nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, I'm sorry, Mark, but I can't pretend anymore." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to let my anger take control. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. "Let's make this clear. We are done. I'll help Harry with Mom's funeral, and then we'll deal with the divorce." Emily nodded again, and I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. Harry put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Let's get through today," he said softly. "We have a lot to take care of." With these words, we left the house. Harry and I drove to the country house where our parents had lived. As we made our way through the winding roads, I couldn't help but think that maybe it would have been better to skip stopping by my home and head straight to the country house to focus on the funeral arrangements. When we arrived, we immediately began organizing the funeral. It was a somber affair, the usual rituals and condolences from friends and family. Emily did not take part in any of it, which didn't surprise me. Her absence was a painful reminder of the growing chasm between us. After some time, the funeral concluded and we returned home. I found that Emily had already filed for divorce. Seeing the paperwork on the table didn't surprise me much, though it stung nonetheless. "Well, have you already taken care of everything?" I asked sarcastically, unable to mask the bitterness in my voice. "Let's divide it 90/10. Emily's eyes flashed with indignation. "I'm not like that, Mark," she snapped. "Yes, I had no doubt," I replied with heavy irony. The days that followed were filled with the bureaucratic hassle of both the divorce and the trial for the attack on Mr. Roberts. I despised every moment of it. Dealing with lawyers, court dates, and endless paperwork was exhausting, but I endured it, knowing there was no other choice. Regarding the divorce and division of property, I decided to leave most of it to Emily. I didn't want to prolong the agony or fight over material possessions. I agreed to give her the house and move to the country house where my mother had died. I would see the children every other day, a compromise that pained me but seemed necessary for their stability. The divorce proceedings were grueling. Emily and her lawyer pushed for more than I thought fair, but I complied, hoping to end the ordeal quickly. As for the trial over the attack, I knew I had to face the consequences of my actions. Despite my anger and resentment, I accepted that the court would likely side with Emily and Mr. Roberts. As I settled into the country house, I found some solace in its familiarity. It was where I had grown up, and now it would be a place of healing. The days ahead were uncertain, but I took them one step at a time, focusing on rebuilding my life and being there for my children. The trial for my attack on Mr. Roberts finally came to an end. The judge sentenced me to correctional labor and imposed a hefty fine. It felt like a cruel joke. He had stolen my wife, and now he was receiving money because of it. I could hardly believe the irony of the situation. With the divorce finalized and my legal troubles behind me, I moved fully into the country house. The responsibilities around the house, especially those that had been my mother's, now fell on me. It was therapeutic in a way, allowing me to keep my mind off Emily and focus on something productive. But trouble was never far away. One afternoon, I received a frantic call from Emily. Our daughter Lily had been playing on the playground when she ran out onto the roadway. Emily, distracted by her phone, didn't notice until it was too late. An SUV struck Lily and she was rushed to the emergency room. My heart dropped as I listened to Emily's panicked voice. I rushed to the hospital, driving as fast as I could. When I arrived, I found Emily in the corridor outside the emergency room. She looked distraught, tears streaming down her face. There was a strong temptation to lash out at her, to blame her for everything, not just for the divorce, but also for her negligence as a mother. I wanted to tell her how I felt, to release the pent-up anger and frustration. Emily seemed to sense what I was thinking. She kept her distance, her eyes pleading for understanding. But I couldn't bring myself to speak. The minutes dragged on as we waited for news about Lily. 5 hours later, a surgeon finally emerged from the emergency room. His expression was serious but not hopeless. "Your daughter is not in immediate danger," he said, addressing both of us. "However, she will need a hip bone prosthesis to maintain her vital functions. The cost is quite significant." Hearing this, my desire to berate Emily grew even stronger. I wanted to scream at her for failing to protect our daughter, but I held back, knowing that anger wouldn't help Lily. We needed to focus on finding a way to pay for the surgery. The surgeon explained that Lily would need to rest and visiting her was not allowed for the time being. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. As we left the hospital, I offered to drop Emily off at her house. The drive was silent, the weight of our situation hanging heavily in the air. When we arrived at her place, I finally broke the silence. "We need to think about what the next steps are," I said, my voice cold and detached, "and where we're going to get the money for the prosthesis." Emily looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt and sadness. "I'm sorry, Mark," she whispered. I didn't respond. Instead, I watched her get out of the car and walk to her door. As I drove back to the country house, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I had to find a way to pay for Lily's surgery, and I had to do it quickly. The thought of seeing my daughter suffer was unbearable. Back at the house, I sat down at the kitchen table trying to figure out a plan. Sitting at the kitchen table, my mind racing with possibilities, I suddenly remembered something. Emily had once mentioned that Mr. Roberts had a wealthy relative living in Europe who owned a car dealership. This man would definitely have the money needed for Lily's hip prosthesis. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. I picked up my phone and dialed Emily's number. It rang several times, but there was no answer. How could she go to bed when this had happened to our daughter? Frustration and anger boiled within me as I considered our limited options. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, my phone rang. Emily was calling back. "Mark, what is it?" she asked, her voice groggy. "I have an idea," I said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Mr. Roberts has a rich relative in Europe who owns a car dealership. We need to ask him for the money for Lily's prosthesis." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Emily, did you hear me?" I prompted. "Yes, I heard you," she finally replied, her tone hesitant. "We need to meet and discuss this in person," I insisted. "All right," she agreed, sounding reluctant. We arranged to meet at a cafe in the city. When we met at the cafe, Emily seemed uneasy. I could sense that something was off. "Why do you look so unhappy about this opportunity?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. She avoided my gaze, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "It's complicated, Mark," she said softly. "What's the matter?" I pressed. "Why are you avoiding answering me?" She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Since you left and began living separately, my relationship with Mr. Roberts has deteriorated. To put it mildly, things have gotten worse between us. It's not a given that he'll agree to help us for Lily's sake." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice rising. "You're telling me that this man who you chose over our family won't help save our daughter?" Emily looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know, Mark. I just don't know." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You need to make him help us," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "You owe this to Lily. You ruined everything yourself." My outburst drew the attention of the other cafe patrons. Emily flinched at my words, her expression a mix of guilt and fear. "Mark, please calm down," she pleaded. "Calm down? How can I calm down when our daughter's life is at stake?" I retorted, my voice echoing in the cafe. "You need to do whatever it takes to get the money from his relative. This is your mess and you need to fix it." Emily's face turned pale. It seemed to me that deep down she regretted ever telling me about the rich relative of Mr. Roberts. She realized the gravity of the situation, but her reluctance to act was infuriating. I leaned forward, my eyes boring into hers. "You have to convince him, Emily, for Lily's sake." She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I'll try," she whispered. As we left the cafe, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Emily's attitude had shocked me. I had hoped she would show more resolve, more determination to help our daughter. I decided to stay in the city for the near future to be closer to Lily. I found a cheap hostel not far from the hospital and rented a room. It was a far cry from the comforts of the country house, but I didn't care. My only concern was my daughter's well-being. I was growing increasingly frustrated with how long it was taking Emily to resolve the issue with Mr. Roberts. The next day, around noon, my phone rang. It was Emily. "Mark, I spoke to him. He said no," she said, her voice trembling. "He also told me that he thought I was different from what I turned out to be and that he has no reason to help me anymore." Anger surged through me. "What do you mean he said no? After everything, he just refuses to help?" I spat, barely able to contain my fury. "Don't come near me, Emily. If I see you, I swear I might kill you. Just tell me where he is." "He's at his apartment," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, I hung up and drove straight to Mr. Roberts' apartment. My mind was a whirlwind of anger and determination. When I arrived, I knocked on the door, my fist pounding with urgency. There was no answer. I tried again, harder this time, but still nothing. Frustrated, I decided to go around the building, looking for another way in. Unlike last time, the windows were closed, making it impossible to climb through them. Desperate, I spotted a stone by the roadside. I picked it up and hurled it at one of the windows with all my strength. The glass shattered, and moments later, Mr. Roberts came running out, shouting angrily. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled, his face red with fury. I took a deep breath, trying to control my rage. "Let's go inside," I said, my voice low and menacing. "We need to talk, and I don't want to start a scene out here." He hesitated, but seeing the determination in my eyes, he relented and led the way back into the apartment. As we entered, I could feel the tension in the air. I was ready to do whatever it took to get the help Lily needed. "Sit down," I commanded, pointing to the living room. He sat, his eyes wary. I stood before him, trying to keep my composure. "Now let's talk about how you're going to help us." His defiance only fueled my anger further. "You don't get to walk away from this, Roberts. You owe it to Lily to help." "I owe you nothing," he snapped. "This is Emily's mess, not mine." Mr. Roberts still refused to pay, and my patience had run out. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You may not have the money for a prosthesis, but I guarantee I have enough for a hitman or a sniper rifle. If you don't help, I will make sure you regret it." Robert's face turned pale, fear evident in his eyes. He was naturally soft, and intimidating him wasn't difficult. Trembling, he pulled out his phone and dialed his wealthy relative in Europe. It was night there, but the call was answered almost immediately, as if the man was already awake or working late. "Hey, it's me," Roberts began, his voice shaky. "I need a favor. My sister was in a terrible accident. She needs a hip prosthesis, and it's urgent. I need a large sum of money to cover the surgery costs." There was a pause on the line. Roberts's relative must have been worried because he had a much better relationship with the teacher's sister. "How much do you need?" came the concerned reply. Roberts glanced at me, and I signaled the amount with my fingers. He relayed the figure, and without further questioning, the relative agreed to send the money immediately. Within moments, the funds were transferred to Roberts's account, and he in turn sent the amount to mine. As I received the notification of the transfer, I knew this act of deception would likely come back to haunt Roberts. His relative would eventually realize he had been lied to, and there would be fallout. But that was no longer my concern. I had what I needed to save Lily. "You should know," I said to Roberts, "that the police might get involved after this, but I don't care. I have what I need now." Roberts' face twisted in a mixture of fear and anger. "You're going to regret this," he spat. "Maybe," I replied coldly, "but my daughter will live, and that's all that matters." I left his apartment without looking back, driving straight to the hospital. When I arrived, I handed over the money. The staff, already prepared for the procedure, sprang into action. The relief washed over me as I watched them ready Lily for surgery. About 40 minutes into the operation, a police squad arrived at the hospital. They found me waiting anxiously in the corridor. I didn't resist as they approached. One of the officers spoke calmly. "Sir, we need you to come with us." "I understand," I replied, standing up. "But please make sure my daughter gets through this surgery first. I've already paid for it." The officer nodded, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. "We'll wait until the surgery is over. For now, please stay here." The next few hours were the longest of my life. I sat in the waiting room under police watch, praying for Lily's recovery. Finally, the surgeon emerged, looking tired but hopeful. "The surgery was successful. Your daughter will need time to heal, but she's going to be all right." Relief flooded through me, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. The officer gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's time to go now, sir." I nodded, allowing them to lead me away. The aftermath of my confrontation with Mr. Roberts was swift. He wasted no time in writing another statement about what I had done. This time I didn't resist at all. When the police arrived, I was calm and compliant, fully prepared to face the consequences of my actions. At the police station, I admitted everything as Mr. Roberts recounted his version of events. "He threatened me," Roberts said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "He said he would hire a hitman or use a sniper rifle if I didn't get the money. I had no choice but to call my relative in Europe and lie to him. Now my relationships with my family have deteriorated because of this." The officers looked at me, waiting for my response. "Everything he said is true," I confirmed, my voice steady. "Mr. Roberts demanded the money back, but I had already paid for Lily's surgery and had nothing left." "I don't have the money," I said plainly. "It's all gone to pay for the prosthesis." "This is your fault," Robert snapped. Because of you, my relationship with my family is in shambles. They know I lied to them, and they'll never trust me again. I looked at him, feeling a mix of regret and resignation. I'm sorry for the fallout this has caused in your life, I said. But my daughter's life was at stake. I would do it again if I had to. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of us. Finally, the officer in charge spoke. Given the severity of the threat and the extortion involved, this is a serious matter. We'll be forwarding this case to the prosecutor's office. You'll need to stay in custody until we can arrange a court date. I nodded, accepting the decision. As they led me back to a holding cell, my thoughts were solely on Lily. She was safe, and that was all that mattered. The consequences of my actions were mine to bear. Days turned into weeks as I awaited my court date. News of the incident spread, and my reputation took a severe hit. Family and friends were divided. Some understood my desperate actions, while others condemned me for the path I had taken. Emily, who had been the catalyst for much of this turmoil, visited me once. Her expression was a mixture of guilt and sorrow. "Mark," she said softly, "I didn't want any of this to happen. I never thought things would go this far." "Neither did I replied, my voice tinged with sadness. "But we have to live with the choices we've made." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Lily's doing well," she said. "The doctors are optimistic about her recovery." "That's all I needed to hear," I said, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Thank you for telling me." The trial had finally come to an end. The courtroom was filled with familiar faces. Mr. Roberts and Emily sat together, their expressions tense. My brother Harry and my father were there too, along with my son Jake. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. I stood there, waiting for the inevitable. The judge's words seemed to echo in the vast room. "Mark, for the crimes of extortion and making criminal threats, you are hereby sentenced to a term in prison." There was a collective gasp, but I remained calm. I had prepared myself for this outcome. Soon the sentence would be executed, and I would be taken away. Before they led me out, I turned to my father and brother. "Please take care of Jake and Lily," I pleaded. "I don't trust anyone else to do it. Make sure they know they're loved and safe." Harry nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We will, Mark. We promise." My father, though stoic, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We'll take good care of them, son. Don't worry about that." I then glanced at Emily. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of the woman I had once loved. She nodded slightly, understanding the gravity of the situation. Despite everything, I felt no more anger towards her or Roberts. That's how the story came to an end, just like my days of freedom, but it doesn't scare me at all.